My brother's fiancée dismantled my family with a single caring sentence. It happened at Sunday dinner, a ritual we'd honored for years. I am 48 years old and a high school history teacher. My world is supposed to be grounded in provable facts. My brother Mark brought Chloe, who seemed perfect for him. The conversation was light until she turned to me. She told everyone it was wonderful seeing me so happy these days. Then she mentioned it must be a relief after my past struggles. The easy laughter at the table died instantly. She was talking about my college anxiety from 2 decades ago. It was a private footnote I had long since moved past. Suddenly it was the main headline of my life. Mark looked at me with this new and terrible pity. My father cleared his throat and looked down at his plate. My mother's smile just completely vanished from her face. Chloe alone seemed unfazed, her expression one of deep empathy. She weaponized my past with a look of genuine concern. I felt like a specimen being examined for cracks. The rest of the dinner was quiet and deeply uncomfortable. When I left, my mother hugged me much longer than usual. It was the kind of hug you give to someone who is broken. Before that dinner, everything with Chloe seemed almost too perfect. My brother Mark had finally found someone after years of casual dating. Chloe was charming and bright, working as an event planner for a charity. She remembered everyone's birthdays and brought thoughtful, inexpensive gifts. She even showed a keen interest in my work as a history teacher. She would ask me questions about local history for hours on end. I see now that she was just gathering data for her campaign. The first warning signs were small enough to dismiss as quirks. I once told her a personal story about a high school football injury. It was a stupid, embarrassing moment I rarely shared with anyone. A week later at a family barbecue, she retold the story to my father. She presented the details with incredible accuracy, but claimed Mark told her, "I remember feeling a strange sense of violation, of personal history being stolen, but I said nothing because correcting her would have seemed incredibly petty. Mark was beaming at her, so proud of how well she fit in." Another time, she reorganized my mother's kitchen pantry without asking. She explained it was a surprise to make things more efficient for her. My mother praised her for being so thoughtful and considerate. I was the only one who saw it as a quiet invasion of territory. She was slowly rewriting our family's routines and habits. She would gently suggest better ways of doing everything we had always done. She framed all of her intrusions as acts of selfless love. No one else seemed to notice the subtle shift in power. My own parents started quoting her opinions on politics and movies. They spoke of her with a reverence that used to be reserved for family. I tried to convince myself that I was just being a cynical older brother. I told myself that her eagerness was a sign of her desire to belong. It was easier to believe that than to confront the alternative. It was easier to pretend that her intensity was just affection. These small moments were the foundation she was carefully building. Each ignored oddity was another brick in the wall she built around them. The incident at the dinner wasn't an attack out of nowhere. It was a declaration that her construction was finally complete. She had spent months studying us, learning our weaknesses and our strengths. Now she was ready to begin the real renovation. The ground had been prepared for a very long time. I just had been stubbornly refusing to look down at my feet. The first real crack in the foundation appeared on a Tuesday. I received a phone call from my mother during my lunch break. This was unusual because she knew my school schedule perfectly. Her voice on the line was tight with a specific kind of worry. She asked how I was really holding up with everything at work. I told her that things were fine, just the usual mid-semester rush. There was a long pause on her end of the line. Then she told me that she had a long talk with Chloe. She said Chloe was deeply concerned about the stress I was under. My stomach tightened because I knew this was a preamble to something else. My mother then said the words that changed everything completely. She told me Chloe had confided that I was thinking of quitting. She said I felt burned out and that the administration didn't value me. This was a lie of breathtaking audacity and precision. I loved my job and had never said anything to the contrary. My career as a teacher was a core part of my identity. I denied it immediately, perhaps a little too loudly. I could hear the skepticism in my mother's careful silence. She told me it was okay if I was struggling with things. She said there was no shame in admitting that I needed a change. She explained that Chloe only told her to see if the family could help. Every word she spoke was filtered through Chloe's false narrative of concern. I was arguing against a version of myself I didn't even recognize. My own mother was treating me like a fragile, unreliable narrator. The feeling of betrayal was so sharp it felt like a physical blow. It was the first time I realized Chloe wasn't just annoying. She was actively and maliciously working to undermine my standing. She had taken my stability and reframed it as a desperate crisis. After the call, I couldn't even eat my lunch. I just sat at my desk staring at student essays. I started to doubt myself for the very first time. Had I said something that could have been misinterpreted so badly? Was I projecting an unhappiness that I wasn't even aware of? The illusion of control I had over my own life was gone. She had successfully planted a seed of doubt, not just in my family, but in me. I was completely and utterly trapped by her manufactured care. Any anger I showed would only prove her right. I spent the rest of that week in a state of deep confusion. I knew I had to talk to Mark directly about the situation. Letting this lie fester felt like a weakness I could not afford. I drove over to his house that Saturday under the pretense of borrowing a tool. I found him in the garage working on a woodworking project. The smell of sawdust and oil usually felt comforting and familiar. We had solved many of life's problems in that garage over the years. I decided to approach the topic as calmly as I possibly could. I told him about the phone call I had with our mother. I explained that Chloe had told her a damaging and untrue story. I watched his face carefully for a sign of solidarity or shock. Instead, his expression became guarded and a little bit defensive. He put down his sanding block and leaned against his workbench. He told me that I was probably just taking things the wrong way. He said that Chloe was one of the most caring people he had ever met. He explained that she sometimes gets overeager in her desire to help. He insisted that she would never do anything to hurt me intentionally. He suggested that her concern likely came from a place of genuine love. He then turned the entire situation back around onto me. He asked if maybe I had been a little stressed out lately. He said I seemed more on edge since they had gotten engaged. My own brother was subtly suggesting that I was the real problem. He used the word sensitive, which felt like a small, sharp knife. It was a dismissal of my reality and my legitimate feelings. I felt a surge of misplaced guilt, as if I were the one creating drama. Maybe I was being jealous of the attention she was getting. Maybe I was the one who was misinterpreting her good intentions. He was gaslighting me without even realizing what he was doing. He was just repeating the script that she had already written for him. The conversation ended with him putting a hand on my shoulder. He told me to just let it go for the sake of family peace. I left his house that day feeling more alone than ever before. I had tried to find an ally in my own brother. Instead, I found a gatekeeper for the woman who was isolating me. The door to my closest relationship had been quietly closed. After that conversation with Mark, something inside me shifted permanently. I stopped looking for validation or trying to correct the record. Instead, I decided to just watch her as a historian would. I started observing her methods and documenting her quiet aggressions. The evidence I needed began to accumulate much faster than I expected. My father and I have an annual fishing trip every single spring. We have not missed this trip in more than 20 years. A few days before we were set to leave, I got a text. It was from my dad, and his message sounded clipped and hurt. He asked why I had decided to cancel on him this year. I was confused and called him back almost immediately. He explained that Chloe had called him earlier that same day. She told him I was completely swamped with grading final papers. She said I was too overwhelmed to go, but was afraid to disappoint him. She was only calling him to try and save me the awkwardness. I felt a type of cold fury that was entirely new to me. She was now actively severing my most important family connections. I explained the truth to my father, but the damage was done. The excitement for the trip was replaced with a cloud of drama. We decided it was probably best to just postpone it for now. A week later, my brother called me and his voice was angry. He accused me of saying something incredibly cruel to Chloe. He said she had come to him in tears the night before. She told him that I had dismissed her charity work. She claimed I said it was just a pathetic way to network with rich people. This was a sophisticated lie designed to make me seem cynical and mean. It was another direct attack on my character. I denied it, but my words felt hollow over the phone. It was my simple denial against her well-practiced performance of being wounded. I knew then that there was no more room for doubt. This was not a series of unfortunate, clumsy misunderstandings. This was a deliberate and systematic campaign to completely isolate me. She was dismantling my relationships and my reputation piece by piece. I still had not decided on what action I was going to take. For now, I was just gathering the facts and waiting. The stakes were no longer about my feelings, but about my survival. The moment I had been waiting for arrived on a Sunday afternoon. The entire family was at my house to discuss wedding plans. I had intentionally left them alone in the living room for a moment. I went upstairs to my study to retrieve a specific book. I knew that I had left the door to that room closed. Now it was standing slightly ajar, letting a thin line of light cut across the hallway floor. A cold sense of certainty washed over me as I walked towards it. I pushed the door open and found Chloe standing beside my desk. Her back was to me, and she was hastily shoving something into her large leather handbag. I saw the faded blue canvas cover of my old college journal. It was the same journal where I had written about my anxiety. This was the source material for her entire psychological campaign against me. She turned around with a practiced jump of surprise on her face. I did not raise my voice or show any outward sign of anger. I simply asked her what she was doing in my private study. She began her performance immediately, a masterpiece of feigned embarrassment. She claimed she had been looking for a pen to write down a caterer's number. She said the journal was just sitting on my desk, open for anyone to see. She explained that she picked it up out of a loving curiosity. She just wanted to understand me better before officially joining our family. She tried to frame this deep violation as an act of profound empathy, but this time her story had a fatal and verifiable flaw. I calmly told her that her explanation was simply not true. I pointed out that the journal was kept in the bottom drawer of my desk. It was underneath a stack of old maps from my teaching collection. She would have needed to actively search through my private things to find it. My brother Mark and my mother walked in then, drawn by the tension. They saw Chloe with tears welling in her eyes. They saw me standing there calm and resolute. I held my hand out and asked her to give the journal back to me. It was no longer an accusation, it was a simple statement of fact. This was the moment the Cold War finally turned hot. I was done observing and documenting from a safe distance. The silence in my study was heavy and suffocating. Chloe took a shaky breath and pulled the journal from her bag. She placed it in my outstretched hand with a look of deep sorrow. She whispered that she was sorry I saw her love as an attack. It was a masterful move that instantly framed her as the victim. My brother Mark immediately went to her side and put his arm around her. He didn't look at me with confusion, but with genuine anger. He told me that I had finally gone way too far this time. He accused me of looking for a reason to hate her from the start. He said I was twisting her every action into something ugly and malicious. He called my behavior paranoid and said I was being incredibly cruel. My mother's reaction was somehow even more devastating to witness. She approached me with a look of profound and weary pity. She spoke to me in the calm tone one uses for someone unwell. She said I needed to calm down and apologize to poor Chloe. She suggested that the stress from my job was making me irrational. She completely accepted the narrative that this violation was just a clumsy act of love. In that single moment, my entire world shifted on its axis. I had presented them with cold, undeniable proof of her deception. They looked at the evidence and chose to see it as a symptom of my own instability. I said nothing else to them because there was nothing left to say. There was no argument that could penetrate their wall of willful ignorance. I was no longer a son or a brother in their eyes. I was simply a problem that needed to be carefully managed. They left my house a few minutes later. A united front of concern. Mark was comforting a quietly sobbing Chloe as they walked out. My mother gave me one last look of deep, crushing disappointment. I was left standing all alone in my own study. The house was completely silent except for the ticking of a clock. My isolation was no longer just a feeling inside my head. It was now a physical and undeniable reality. I was an island. The fallout was quiet, absolute, and brutally efficient. I did not feel sadness in the days that followed that confrontation. The space where my grief should have been was filled instead with a cold and quiet clarity. I finally understood that I was not in a family disagreement. I was in a war for my own reality and reputation. I also understood that emotional appeals and truth were useless weapons. The only way to fight a narrative is with indisputable facts. My hope for reconciliation or understanding was completely dead now. All I wanted was to take back the power she had stolen from me. The next Monday morning, I began my own historical research project. I spent hours online searching for a reputable private investigator. I found a man who was a former police detective with 30 years of experience. His office was in a nondescript building downtown, deliberately anonymous. The room was sparse and clean, containing only a desk and 2 chairs. I sat down and explained the situation in a calm, detached voice. I did not talk about my feelings of betrayal or my family's blindness. I simply gave him Chloe's full name and date of birth. I requested a comprehensive background check on her entire life. I told him I needed to know everything about her past relationships. I needed to see if a pattern of this behavior existed before. I stressed the absolute need for complete and total discretion in his work. He listened without judgment, just taking notes on a yellow legal pad. He quoted me a price that was expensive but not impossible. This was no longer about saving my family from their own bad judgment. It was about protecting myself from a very clear and present danger. A part of me knew I was crossing a significant moral line. I was hiring a stranger to dig into the life of my brother's fiancée, but the person who would have felt guilt about that was gone. He had been replaced by someone colder and much more pragmatic. I paid the investigator his initial fee in cash. The transaction felt sterile and final, like buying a weapon. I walked out of that office and back into the afternoon sun. I felt no relief and I felt no remorse. I simply felt the grim satisfaction of a plan set in motion. There was absolutely no turning back from this. The investigator's report arrived in my email 2 weeks later. The intervening time had been filled with a profound and absolute silence. My family did not call or text me even a single time. I was an inconvenient problem that they had successfully excised. I opened the encrypted file with a hand that was surprisingly steady. The report was 20 pages long, written in a spare, clinical style. It detailed the last 10 years of Chloe's life with brutal efficiency. The facts confirmed every single one of my darkest suspicions. She had been engaged twice before to 2 different men. In both cases, a clear and disturbing pattern had emerged. She systematically worked to isolate her fiancés from their families. The report included summaries of interviews with former friends and neighbors. They described her as someone who thrived on creating drama and discord. But the most damning evidence was attached on the final pages. There were scanned copies of 2 separate restraining orders. They had been filed against her by the sisters of her previous fiancés. I read the sworn statements, and a cold chill went down my spine. The women described her campaign of gaslighting and psychological abuse. They detailed how Chloe had tried to convince everyone they were mentally unstable. It was my own experience mirrored back at me in formal legal language. The feeling I had was not triumph, but a hollow, sickening vindication. I was not paranoid, and I was not imagining any of this. I was simply the third act in a play she had perfected. My family was not uniquely blind. They were just her latest audience. The tension in my chest tightened into a hard, painful knot. I was now the sole possessor of this catastrophic truth. The engagement party for Mark and Chloe was that coming weekend. I knew that I was in far too deep to back out now. My actions had led me to this single, unavoidable moment of decision. The report on my screen was not a key to reconciliation. It was a bomb that would destroy everything and everyone it touched. I had to decide if I was willing to be the one to light the fuse. I arrived at the engagement party feeling like a ghost. The restaurant was filled with cheerful music and polite, meaningless chatter. I saw the faces of people I had known my entire life. They smiled and waved at me from across the room. I felt no connection to any of them anymore. My only purpose for being there was inside my briefcase. I had spent the morning preparing 3 identical manila folders. Each one contained a clean copy of the investigator's report. I had placed the restraining orders right on the very top. I waited for the right moment after the toasts had been made. My parents and my brother Mark were all sitting together at their table. Chloe was across the room, charming a group of her friends. I walked over to the table, and they looked up at me with surprise. I did not offer a greeting or a fake smile. I simply placed one folder in front of my father. I placed the second one in front of my mother. I placed the final folder directly in front of Mark. I told them that they needed to read this information carefully. I said it was not my opinion or another emotional argument. It was a collection of public records and verifiable facts. My voice was calm and steady, completely devoid of any emotion. I then stepped away from the table without another word. I stood near the back of the room and simply watched watched them. I saw their initial confusion as they opened the folders. I watched their expressions shift as they began to read the first page. My mother's hand went to her mouth in a gesture of shock. My father's face became a grim, unreadable mask of stone. I watched my brother's confident posture slowly begin to crumble. He read the legal filings with an almost desperate intensity. The color drained completely from his face in just a few moments. From across the room, Chloe noticed the sudden change in atmosphere. She started walking toward them with a concerned look on her face. I did not stay to watch her final, desperate performance. I had delivered the evidence. The verdict was now up to them. I turned around and walked out of the restaurant. I did not look back. There were no angry phone calls in the days that followed. No one demanded an explanation or a dramatic final confrontation. The silence they had imposed on me before was now returned. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket covering everything that had happened. I learned that the wedding was called off from a brief text. My father sent it to me a week after the party. It said only that Chloe was gone and that Mark was dealing with it. There was no apology for their doubt or blindness. There was no acknowledgement of the damage that had been done. It was just a cold statement of fact, a final entry in a logbook. I have not seen my family in the 6 months since then. Thanksgiving passed with a quiet meal alone in my own house. Christmas was just another day at the end of the calendar. We are no longer a family in any meaningful sense of the word. We are just a small group of people with a shared broken history. I won the war, but I completely lost everything in the process. I saved them from her, but I could not save them from themselves. Sometimes I look at an old family photograph on my mantelpiece. It shows all of us laughing together at a forgotten summer barbecue. We look happy and we look like we actually belong together, but the people in that picture are strangers to me now. They are ghosts from a life that someone else used to live. There was no lesson learned from this, and there was no comfort found. There is only the quiet house and the lingering brutal truth. I have proven that I was right, but I have to live with that victory. It is the loneliest victory that I could have ever imagined. If you enjoyed this video, support it with a like, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with your thoughts. Your reaction helps me create new stories.